Yeah, so I'm a lifer. I've survived, and I'm the proof of the pudding that the impact of what Montessori can have on your children and all children today. So that's really what I want to talk about tonight, and talk about what Montessori has to say to the educational conversation. I will generally follow my notes just because I can go off track and you will still be here at midnight if I'm not careful. So, but at the same time, I do want to make sure there's lots of time at the end for questions. And there is a fair amount of content I'm going to offer to you. So this is our agenda for tonight. Before we get into the agenda, though, I just wanted to give you a couple comments. Just over a year ago, and I do have a witness in this room to help me with this. Just over a year ago, I posted an article on LinkedIn called The World Needs More Montessori. And all of a sudden, within a matter of a couple days, my friend Laura, who's here in the audience, and I'll refer to some of her work as well tonight, contacted me and basically said, your post has gone viral. So within a week, just over a week, and it actually continues to circulate. It's really fascinating. This whole social media stuff fascinates me. It had over 20,000 hits between Facebook and LinkedIn and all the sharing and stuff like that. So I think there's something timely about that. There's something that we are doing in Montessori that the time is right. It should have been right long ago, but if wasn't, now is the time right. And people want to understand more about what Montessori has to offer. And I want to go on to say that more than ever before, traditional notions of education, they're not serving our children today. And the interesting thing is there's few proven solutions. We keep thinking there are, but there's very few out there that are proven. And Montessori is the exception. And more the efficacy of Montessori and people doing work in Montessori in terms of research and again, point to Laura as one of the many people in the world doing that background, it's increasing and it's supporting everything we know about Montessori. It is already the largest alternative method of education in the world. And in North America alone, there's over 6,000 Montessori schools in name. So much of what I want to share with you tonight is my synthesis based on my personal experience with thousands of parents, students, and teachers in Montessori, as well as my own curiosity about what's going on in education today and what our children will need. This is also informed by what young people are already experiencing in post-secondary education, employment, and citizenship. As well as an active participant, I'm also an observer of life. So thank you to Guidepost again for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. So here's our agenda, the crystal ball. What's going on? And how can we project what's going to happen in the future? State of the Union, what's happening in education? What do employers say? What's the corporate world? What are people looking for in young people? What are progressive educators predicting? And I qualify that because it's fascinating what's out there being written. And I will cite just a few examples, but there's tons of examples of what people are saying education should look like or could look like. And then I will make the link try to make the link of how does Montessori support children and society's needs today and tomorrow. So here's a toddler. In 2040, she will be 25. That is only 22 years from now. That's not very long. And if you have a toddler or an infant or a child that's even older, that's not far down the road. Here's an adolescent, 13-year-old, grappling with life and volumes of information and influence. What will their future look like? 12 years from now, they'll be 25. And here's my own son, Mark. He is 25. And 25 years ago, I was just like you. I was asking myself the question, is Montessori, I'm a die-in-the-wool Montessorian, and I'm still asking myself the question, is it the right thing? Is this going to serve him? And he's probably now one of the biggest advocates of Montessori, having gone through it all the way to the end of middle school. And interestingly, he just recently got engaged, and this is his fiance, they are saving for Montessori. And then I couldn't, 2 children, you have to be fair. The younger one has to. So this is his sister, Emma, who's also obviously a Montessori graduate. My son is a civil engineer. My daughter is doing a master's degree in public health. So both huge advocates of Montessori. So as I said, I was sitting in the same place. In fact, today, I wonder what my grandchildren. Not quite there yet, but soon. And I want to make sure Montessori is there for them and that they can access it. Okay, slight change of. It was really fascinating. I love Tom Friedman. He's an interesting New York Times journalist. He also writes stuff for the New Yorker as well. But he's also a little bit of a futurist, and he's always sort of trying to predict what are the trends, what's going on. The reality is we can't know, but we can listen to what other people are saying. And what we do know is likely there's going to be a ton of change. He's a huge advocate of lifelong learning. And recently, he actually wrote an article in the New York Times, I think called While You Were Sleeping. Very interesting article if you have a chance to pull it up after tonight. And in that article, he actually quoted 2 women, Heather McGowan and Chris Shipley, from an organization called Future is Learning. And we can go to the next slide, and I just found this quote from them absolutely fascinating. So the underlining is mine, by the way. Education needs to shift from education as a content transfer to learning as a continuous process where the focused outcome is the ability to learn and adapt with agency, as opposed to the transactional action of acquiring a skill set. Instructors, teachers move from guiding and accessing that transfer process to providing social and emotional support to the individual as they move into the role of driving their own continuous learning. This is the child's natural state. This is what people who know nothing about Montessori are saying and talking about. So typical Montessori kid, I had to dig deeper into who this Chris Shipley and Heather McGowan were and what's the work they're doing. And their organization is called Future is Learning. And they have a whole bunch of graphics on their website, but I found this one in particular quite fascinating. This is their graphic of how they see employment and learning happening going forward. And their model is that learning is going to be happening constantly in parallel with work, rather than the old paradigm where education, work, and retire. Their concept is there's probably some front-end early education, but once even into high school or certainly college, it now becomes a constant back and forth between learning and working. And that, in fact, we work to learn. This idea that actually by working, we continue to become lifelong learners. This is Montessori classroom as well. That paradigm of the child constantly going back and forth between working and learning and working and learning. I looked at it, I thought, we've got a graphic for Montessori. This is awesome. So anyways, many of you may already be experiencing this in your own employment or your own working world, that lifelong learning is what it's all about. The stats change every day, but right now I think the current stat is 17 jobs, different jobs in 5 different careers will be the norm for most college graduates today. So what are we doing to prepare our children for that world and that reality? This came from the World Economic Forum, and this is what they've identified as the most important job skills for 2020. First one being complex problem solving. Beyond that, some of the other top requirements or skill sets they're looking for today: critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and emotional intelligence. So in this context, I think it begs the question, what is the state of education today, both in the US and globally? And I think even globally is even more important than ever before because we are very much living in a global society. Fascinating, it's fascinating. There are some really amazing examples of some dynamic progressive education going on. But the majority of what's happening is still the status quo. This is not only important to you as parents, but also as citizens and possibly as employers and employees. The majority of new graduates coming out of school today are still being educated in a mechanized model of everyone doing the same thing at the same time. Grades, tests, curriculums, and styles of teaching do not easily support the individual, community, or the development of creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, or communication, the very skills required today and tomorrow that were just identified in the previous slide. And yet, who decides when the student speaks and when they don't? Who determines the pace of learning? The educational alternatives today make up 10% or less of available programs. So we still have this paradox going on of this very old mechanized method in a world where we demand something different. And we're also still in a world where the greatest driver today for many parents and students are still test scores where there is only one right answer. And I had a interesting visit with a former parent the other day, and she has transitioned her children into conventional education for a whole myriad of reasons. And her 8-year-old son said, "Mom, I now have to learn to think inside the box because they won't let me think outside the box." And that is the nature, unfortunately, for many children of what education is all about today. There is still only just one right answer. I also used to use this phrase a lot of times with parents. And I understand most of us came through conventional education. I was in conventional education for 15 years. And we're great, we're fine, we're successful, we're doing well. And so, it begs the question, why does it matter? Because I would argue today, just because it was good enough before, and maybe it could have been better, but just because it was good enough, it served us well, we're all here happy and successful, I actually don't believe today it's good enough for our children in the future. And we have to bring about change because of that. For fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And then underneath our education system, everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. And I think that's one of the things that we struggle with. Okay. I just put a sample. I haven't given you a whole book list of books I've referred to or I'm looking at. I put a sample of some books up there. Some books that are saying interesting things about education that when you read them and you think, oh my gosh, we do that in Montessori. But there are books that I will refer to some of them in the presentation. I'll talk a little bit more about becoming brilliant in a minute. The other thing I wanted to say is there are many summaries out there. I said this at the beginning of what our children need today and in the future. Organizations like the National Association of Independent Schools, authors and presenters, and many of you may have seen Ken Robinson's TED Talk. I mean, it seems to be the most popular TED Talk of all. Or people like Tony Wagner talking about what education needs. Ellen Galinsky, she was actually the advisor to President Obama for a while in the White House on what early childhood education should be. Certainly Carol Dweck or Angela Duckworth or even Daniel Pink in Drive talks about Montessori and Montessori being one of the best examples of education to help create young people that are motivated and how do we motivate employees. But they all settle on a similar group of qualities. And these are qualities that we need to embrace today. So what I did was, rather than take a Montessori text, and we'll talk about some of the Montessori references that I did use for today as well, I actually did take this book and use their 6 C's. Now, I actually added a 7. Compassionate Citizenship is my own version of modifying this book. But I thought it was interesting to look at it in the lens of another book. This book actually was a book referred to me by Jackie Constantino from Montessori in the Public Sector, and so I thought it was also an interesting. I mean, there was some good qualifications behind the recommendation that made me feel confident in using it. The other thing I want to say about the book, and you will see slides that indicate that, one of the things that's really interesting that a lot of books don't do, or a lot of treatises on this, is they take each of the 6 C's and actually see them as a spectrum. So it's not like, oh, now I can be collaborative, or oh, now I can be creative. She gives examples of what different levels of growth look like in each one of these 6 C's. So here's some samples of some of the Montessori sources. Certainly the absorbent mind to educate the human potential. Laura Florishaw's white papers, which I love and find is a great resource. There's that one in real life. And then certainly Angeline Stahl-Lillard's new book, or old book, but she's come out with a brand new edition, which is updated in terms of current research on Montessori, is also another one of the quintessential books out there that is scientifically supporting what's going on in Montessori and continuing to do some amazing research. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is collaboration. This is what I meant by there, and I'm not going to go through them in each of the 6 slides, but these are the examples of what they would see as the spectrum of collaboration. So on my own, side by side, back and forth, building it together. So for example, babies are born social, but they don't know how to self-regulate. Until a child learns to self-regulate and then to express opinions in a respectful way and hear what others are saying, collaboration is difficult. Children can start to work in the domain of back and forth, often though by about age 4, if given the opportunity. So, even if you're parents at home to say, or in the classroom, a child coming up and saying, Trevor, can I work with you on the red rods? Parents can encourage this at home by working together on something like, let's unpack the groceries together, or the dishwasher, or set the table. So it's really that back and forth and working on something together. Collaboration in Montessori. Interestingly, Angeline Stahl-Lillard had 10 pages on collaboration in Montessori because there's so many examples. And I do want to say also each one of these C's, none of them exist in isolation. They're all completely integrated, but just for the purposes of tonight, I will isolate pictures and ideas in Montessori, but you could look at any one of those and probably cover off all 6 C's, maybe the 7 C's. Collaboration occurs naturally in Montessori all the time. It's organic and it's never forced, though, which is what's beautiful. And I saw beautiful examples of that just today. Julie Brown's here, and we had a group of 3 children in a 6-9 class presenting to us a lesson, and it was absolutely beautiful. And the back and forth that they demonstrated was fantastic. It functions successfully also because there's less emphasis on comparison. Collaboration can be hampered by competitiveness in young children. Montessori does not depend also on an extrinsic motivation. Angeline Stahl-Lillard, as I said, the author of Montessori, The Science Behind the Genius, has dedicated 10 pages of her book on collaborative learning in the Montessori classrooms. There is a natural progression towards collaboration in Montessori. Certainly from the very young child up to the elementary, because as the elementary child becomes more social and is naturally looking outward towards society, you see increased examples of collaboration. But as I said, it's natural. It's not artificially forced. It also is a period that collaboration happens because it's also a period of moral development. And children are asking, what's fair, what's not fair, or, and making these judgments. Research indicates that students who have been in Montessori until the end of upper elementary are more pro-social than peers who have experienced conventional education. When my own children were young, I was a huge fan of cooperative board games just for this very reason. Mixed age groups also successfully support collaboration, and they are a hallmark of authentic Montessori, although they support all of the C's. But it starts with collaboration, and you do need to have that foundation of collaboration to have all the other things happen successfully. The education of even a small child, therefore, does not aim at preparing him for school, but for life. And you see so many examples. Again, I saw lots of beautiful examples of it today, of younger children helping, or older children helping younger children. And this comfort of children really working together, just regardless of the age. I did try and find a couple pictures from Guidepost, and they are also very much companions on a journey. Montessori environments encourage individuals to see themselves as companions on the journey rather than competitors or even teammates, where the success of the group is dependent on the success of every member of the team. Montessori students naturally learn that everyone has something to offer, including themselves, and everyone can also learn from other perspectives. So the next C is communication, and again, that's the levels of communication that they outlined in the book. Highly developed communication is not just putting personal ideas out there, but actively listening to others. It is necessary for successful collaboration. The highest level of written communication is clear and not leaving the reader to wonder what the coherent argument is. I'm struggling with that one right now. Sorry, that's my own writing. Sophisticated communication is also knowing what information is not needed or learning when an opinion may not need to be expressed. Difficulty with this today because of technology sometimes happens because the face-to-face interaction is critical. And with it being reduced, the amount of experience the child has with reading nonverbal signs is sometimes compromised. This is how children learn what's appropriate. We have all had the email that has been completely misinterpreted without that face-to-face dialogue. Communication takes a lot of practice for children. They need to see us doing it and taking our eyes off our screens to model for our children effective communication. And I will reference Laura again in her most recent volume 4 of her Montessori white papers. There's an excellent article, I meant to bring a copy of it tonight, but on guidelines or guidance for families on how to use technology, and it's a really, really great article that references it. So, communication. In Montessori, children comfortably sit together and work. They have snack or lunch. Classrooms are appropriately social at times, even between young and old. Students are all given opportunities to communicate in many different ways in all different venues. Their thoughts and voices are valued and respected in each of the modes: verbal, written, and even visually. There is deliberately very little digital presence for young children in Montessori, which supports the development of effective communication. Start with the concrete experiences first. I'll talk about this. There was 2 photos, and I'll talk about the other photo in a few minutes because it's actually, this photo is going to come back, and I'll refer to it as to what's significant about it in a minute. Okay, communication, as I said it already, naturally occurs in Montessori as each individual young person is choosing what they need for optimal development. They are doing it within a diverse community where they can offer assistance to peers and receive assistance from one another rather than exclusively from the teacher. This is a critical piece in Montessori, and that is the children are going to each other, and that is not an adult-dominated environment. The adult has a very important role to prepare that environment and help guide the child, but there is very much an opportunity for a tremendous amount, almost a web of communication that goes on in the classroom. Montessori said the greatest sign of success for the teacher is the children are now working as if I do not exist. The notion of asking your peers for help to solve a problem is inherent in Montessori. And the role of community, many families and faculty as well as students view their Montessori classrooms and their schools as communities. And certainly you have a wonderful sense of community at Guidepost. So I congratulate all of you in your role in that community. Communication is integral and has helped to establish these successful communities. So the next one is content. Content's an interesting one. In fact, sometimes I almost thought of leaving it out because I think we have get so focused on content. But there is so much of what Montessori does beautifully when it comes to content. So, and I didn't want to not include that, so I did leave it in. There is a great deal of academic content that is presented to students in Montessori, but it's offered at a time when they're interested and ready for that content, rather than a curriculum dictating when it needs to happen. This has been important in the past and is even more important for children today. Students need foundational knowledge to put new information in context, but the amount of new information today is growing exponentially. So the idea of a child coming out of school knowing everything, I mean, that was gone years ago, let alone today. So it's really key, what content are we giving our children? There was a very recent study that just came out, I think just a couple months ago, that released on Montessori outcomes, though, in South Carolina, that demonstrates significantly more achievement growth on state standardized tests than demographically similar non-Montessori students in math, English language arts, and social studies. So even without focusing on the test or focusing on that content-directed curriculum, the children are still doing extremely well on traditional measures, which I always think is so fascinating. But Montessori is it is rich, developmentally appropriate curriculum, and it's foundational knowledge that is sequentially presented. In Montessori, because the work is hands-on and developmentally appropriate, the children are generally excited by the content. They are excited. They love being at school. I've run into former Montessori students during vacation time, and they can't wait to get back to school, even grade 7 and 8 students. So, how many children do we know at 6 and 7 and 8 who don't want to get up Monday morning and go to school? And that is not uncommon today. The Montessori curriculum is engaging and relevant, but also allows children agency and the ability to follow their own interests. The other thing that's really interesting about the Montessori curriculum, and I've thought of this for years, going back to my own elementary training in the mid-1980s, but the curriculum provides scaffolding for large amounts of information like timelines, classification, and assists children, which is more important than ever, with managing content. It gives them structures and how to manage information, rather than being focused on the specific details or large amounts of memorization. And Montessori said, let us give the child a vision of the whole universe. No matter what we touch, an atom or a cell, we cannot explain it without knowledge of the wide universe. And the fascinating thing, I thought this was a great example. I don't know how many people are familiar with it. This is elementary material. This is the timeline of life. It's actually the geological history of time in a timeline. There is no possible way. I don't think I know any child that has memorized every single thing on the timeline, but they fixate on things that they're interested in. They might be the ice ages or the Carboniferous period when coal was formed, and then diamonds, and they find something of interest, but they also see that timeline as an opportunity to structure all of the information within it. And that's also what's really unique about the Montessori material, and also I think a tremendous help for students as they move on, managing, as I said, content and information going forward. Critical thinking. Frequently commented, in the work I'm doing on my book, I'm interviewing quite a few people, and I've heard a number of times people say there's something about Montessori kids they are expert systems thinkers. They have this ability to pull diverse strands and think about sort of the big picture, but also understand some of the individual pieces within it. And the more I thought about that comment that was made, I kept thinking of examples of young people. I mean, my own Montessori students that I taught are now, many of them in their 40s, sending their own children to Montessori. And they are amazing examples of doing fabulous things in this world. And I think it is very much they see this world that way. They think in a way that is often unique from their peers and allows them to see the big picture as well as the details of the tapestry. We start to see this in the upper elementary child who, through the cosmic education approach that they've been using for a number of years, all the way through, not just in elementary, but all the way, they see how everything is connected from the past to the present and into the future. And then they can start to project their own selves and how they fit into that future, which is really fascinating in terms of that critical thinking. Another key piece to critical thinking is choice. And children in Montessori have choice all day, every day. And decision making is paramount to a student's day in Montessori, as I said. What to do next, how this information fits in with what I already know. It is also critical to be able to question what to accept and what then is important. And it used to always fascinate me. I'm going to read a little bit from this, Becoming Brilliant. We have children go through conventional education for years, and then all of a sudden they hit early adolescence or teen years, and we want them to make good decisions, social decisions, peer pressure decisions, decisions about school. But how much practice have they had making decisions and making choices? Because most of the time they've been told when to open the textbook, when they can go to the bathroom, when is lunchtime, and so much of their day has been dictated. But there's an interesting, I'm just going to read a short passage from this book. How are we doing time-wise? We're doing okay. Short passage from this book, which I think illustrates this. In 2008, the book Power for Learning by Darlene Hammond quoted from two letters that appeared side by side in the New York Times, one from a European student and one from an American. The European student attended high school in Europe and then college in an American university. And he said that whereas American students are bombarded with facts and figures that they were forced to memorize, European students are taught the same subjects, but instead of memorizing them, they were focused on trying to understand them. He also claimed that critical thinking, analysis, and research techniques were taught in high school in Europe, but only appeared here in college. Actually taught earlier than that in Montessori, but anyways. Interestingly, the American student concurred the main reason we rank in the low end in education is that we are primarily taught to memorize text until we reach 10th or 11th grade. Only in 11th grade was this student asked to think logically to solve problems. The student asked plaintively, if we do not know how to analyze a problem, how are we ever going to compete in the real world? The problems we are going to face are not all going to be written down in the textbook with answers in the back. And that's the only quote I'll read from this book, but I just thought it did such a wonderful job of illustrating the importance of critical thinking, but also how so often we're not teaching critical thinking. And sometimes it's something as simple as what do you do when something unexpected happens? That's not part of the script. When the glass breaks or I've seen so many wonderful examples where a whole bead box just goes everywhere. And then there's this moment of, oh, and then they go and figure it out and pick it up and organize it and everything else. I mean, that in itself can be big work for some children and so extraordinarily valuable in knowing that they can do it themselves as well. But asking the question, how do I solve this problem? And who can help me out? Or how can I help out? Is also an important aspect of critical thinking. Creativity. Okay. Dr. Laura Flora-Shaw writes in the article Montessori and Creativity, this one, in her Montessori White Papers, Volume 1, and I quote, many people assume that because Montessori teachers present the materials in sequential steps, especially during the preschool years, that the method inhibits creativity. But Montessori schools, in addition to promoting self-care and self-regulation and other executive functions, are specifically designed to construct knowledge that serves as the foundation for creative thinking and performance. This is one of the many reasons why the last year of the 3 to 6 program is so incredibly important. After acquiring knowledge and skills, the children then have the foundation to create. Leaving the program before the end of a full cycle or even later to attend a conventional school where children are required to do what everyone else is doing will halt that creative momentum. And I'm just going to quickly share another little anecdote. I mentioned the thinking inside the box. So that other same little guy, has been doing cursive for years, and cursive is how he does his, he does all his written work. And he goes to his new school, and they say, well, we don't do cursive here. And he says, well, I do cursive. And so, I think he's still 4 months in, or 6 months in now, in a battle with the teacher every day. You don't do cursive. And yes, he does cursive. And so he quietly defies. He has now come up with a creative solution. He runs a cursive club at lunchtime. And all the other kids want to do that because it's so cool. How do you do this? So I just thought that was such a lovely example of being creative, but also another example of how we stifle children's creativity so often unknowingly. It's not intentional, but we do it. The other thing that's amazing about Montessori is creativity, as Laura's quote refers, does require foundational knowledge. And years ago, I used to have parents come in to look at even some of the activities our children were doing in art and would say, just let them do whatever. Well, the reality is, when you look at many great creative people in history, they have all often had a very classical foundation in music or in art or in writing. And you give the child far more potential when you give them that foundation. And so things like the grammar material, I think, is a fabulous example. And having been in the classroom and worked with children who came later to our program and didn't have that foundation, then it was night and day different, their ability to write and to create and to work. So creativity is enhanced by lived experiences. As I said, great composers and writers often have a classical foundation. We are giving children the tools to create. Free-flowing creativity is wonderful, but it is very limiting. Creativity is the tension between the support of content and the ability to envision something new. Montessori does exactly that. It gives the students tools to build on, like understanding of color, size, shape, through sensorial education, to make sense of our world and then create something new. Or even understanding grammar, geography, history, and writing, and deeper understanding of how in the past creative thinking developed into civilizations can lead to the child's greater imagination. At 12 years of age, Dr. Lillard determined that Montessori children in cognitive and academic measures produced essays that were rated as significantly more creative and as using significantly more sophisticated sentence structure than their peers in conventional education. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the author who just recently passed away, Ursula Le Guin. I was a big fan of hers years ago. But there was a recent interview that they were replaying of her when she passed away. And she wrote a very brilliant fantasy style, created worlds and things like that, a little bit like a Tolkien kind of writer. And she often would say in interviews, her father was an anthropologist, and the education she received in how societies are structured and the things that all societies use, that was her creative foundation to create these imaginary worlds. She needed that foundational knowledge. She needed that content. Confidence. This is a sort of a bit of a catchphrase these days. Everybody wants their children to be confident. Well, what's confident really mean? Confidence is a paradox. Children need to develop this internally and not be rewarded and praised for every milestone. Let them determine how they worked. If they fail, their ability to try it again. Montessori teachers will acknowledge the effort, but often not the outcome. You don't often hear in a Montessori classroom, good girl, great job, high fives, whatever. And it's not that all of these amazing Montessori educators aren't wonderful, caring people, but they want the child to develop the intrinsic ability to determine how they've done in that. And that's what leads to true confidence. That's what gives children the agency to feel good about what they're doing because they are not dependent on somebody else to tell them. This is up to the child to assess and not necessarily to us. Children also develop confidence through agency and independence, as I said. The more they are told what to do and when to do it, the more they will flounder with their own choices and decisions. Further to this, Montessori supports a regular cycle throughout each day of mini failures, which is also important for confidence, where the child receives the feedback directly, often from the material that's self-correcting, without even the adult being the caretaker of what's correct and what's not. This gives them comfort and experience with failure. And your failure is your ability of your child to try it again and again. And again, if you go back to, all the talk about resilience and grit and all these other catchphrases these days that are important, that comes from that ability to embrace failure and to grow from it. This is the photo I used previously as well. And it also comes from putting children in all different experiences and opportunities. Many elementary programs will have discussions regularly as part of their lessons, which will give children confidence to question ideas, to speak in front of a few, or sometimes in front of hundreds. And this was a group of upper elementary and middle school students at the United Nations speaking in front of 1,500 people, confidently defending position papers on solutions to issues that the United Nations were challenged by. This is where you get confidence, is doing things like this. And this is the last one that I added, compassion, citizenship, seeing other feelings, feeling other feelings, and acting from the perspective of others. I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about compassion versus empathy. There's been lots written about this recently too, and that we don't necessarily want empathy, we want compassion. There is a difference, a subtle difference. Compassion is not the same as empathy or altruism, though the concepts are related. While empathy refers to more generally our ability to take the perspective and feel the emotions of another person, compassion is when those feelings and thoughts include the desire to help. And that's what we're going for. A lot of times we talk about we want our children to be empathetic. Actually, I'd like them to be more than empathetic. I'd like them to be compassionate. And compassion also has a level of objectivity that's incredibly important for children to develop. The strong emphasis on collaboration, communication, and community in Montessori assists with the development of compassion. Montessori classrooms, unlike most conventional programs, naturally provide opportunities for communication, collaboration, critical thinking, creativity, compassion, content, and development of confidence throughout every day. Montessori is about respect for each human being and allows children to develop the necessary tools to tackle the world today and tomorrow. The world needs more Montessori, and your children and all children who experience it will have a better chance of success in the future. So I leave you with a Montessori quote: education should no longer be mostly imparting knowledge, but must take a new path, seeking the release of human potentials. Questions? I think there has been historically lots of things that have gone on in the Montessori world that has not always been kind to Montessori being successful in being more broadly implemented. There's, historical things also even in the education world, particularly actually in North America, between Dewey and Montessori, almost 100 years ago. So there's a lot of baggage with Montessori, and that does challenge, I think, Montessori's broad acceptance and embracement. We were just talking today at lunch, though. It is still amazing, though, that despite the increased efficacy and research that is coming out behind Montessori, it is still seldom mentioned in educational programs, academic institutions. There are small pockets of places exposing students at the post-secondary level to Montessori. That's one of the places we have to start. I think the thing that has to happen, so I'm not completely answering your question as to why, but I think the thing that has to happen is we have to now come at it from all sides. We have to, as parents, really demand it and demand access to it. I mean, there is also a perception that it's elitist because It's been accessible to a small number of people for many years, although that's changing slightly as well. I think as educators, we need to demand that we understand more about what's happening in the Montessori world. I think policymakers and employers, like if I was an employer today, I'd want really dynamic young people that I could hire. And so I'd want to demand, and yet it's interesting how few corporations, although it is increasing in the US, I think it's better there than it is in Canada, are demanding and influencing policy, public policy about education. So I think it's a whole lot of things would be my answer. And so to simplify it as one thing, but they all contribute. And I think we all have the opportunity to change that. The reality is it's not, but there's and that does go to your question. That also probably has hindered Montessori because there's different interpretations of what authentic Montessori should be or could be look like. So the history behind it, and I'll jump in anybody else who wants to on this topic, is that in Montessori's lifetime, she wanted children to have access to Montessori. So she did not do anything to protect the use of her name and her method. In fact, she didn't even want to call it a method. She called it a scientific pedagogy. But what happened was the cat got out of the bag. And before, even in her lifetime, she started to realize lots of people were doing things in the name of Montessori, but it wasn't Montessori. And so what has happened in the Montessori world to assist with that, but it is something parents have to wrap their heads around and become educated in, is there are systems of associations or accreditations that help you recognize that school is following the principles of Montessori. So it could be an accreditation, it could be an association with different organizations. I know Guidepost is very aligned with the AMI approach, the Association Montessori International, which is actually the organization that Maria Montessori herself founded. So, that's why you'd come into a classroom here and see something potentially very different from a school down the road that maybe has Montessori in their name, maybe even has some Montessori material, but potentially doesn't necessarily even have Montessori trained educators, or the educators were trained in trainings that wasn't, authentic again, and doing a top-notch job of observing the principles of Montessori. So it's tricky. It is a bit buyer beware in the Montessori world. And so you have a challenge to become educated of what are the things I need to know enough about to make sure my child is in an authentic Montessori school. High fidelity is the other term that sometimes gets used, high fidelity Montessori. In Canada, we do have accreditation, so we use an accreditation. There are some other accreditation. And even teacher training. I mean, I would never send a teacher away to a training center that isn't also accredited, because you have the same challenge within teacher training centers as well. So it is a challenge, and it goes to your question as well. So STEM, I assume everybody knows what STEM is: science, technology, engineering, math. Actually, in Canada, there's a big push to have STEAM, not STEM, because now there's this whole thing that we've just focused so much on science and technology and things like that. And what about the creative arts? And we need the creative arts to come up with innovative scientific ideas and mathematical solutions. So the beauty of Montessori is it's all there. It is completely all there, but we don't call it STEM, and we don't isolate these things, and we don't say now it's the science time and now it's the math time. It's so beautifully integrated. I have a son who excelled at engineering. I have a daughter who's doing a graduate program in public health, coming out of a biology degree and working towards a medical degree. I would say of our alumni from our school, I would say almost 40% ended up in engineering, interestingly. And of the total number of graduates, probably 60 to 65% are in the sciences. And that's without doing STEM. So, and I don't mean to be, joking or derogatory towards STEM. I mean, I think there's some great initiatives that have come out of that. But we've kind of, it's like everything else. We throw the baby out with the bathwater. We go towards this, and in our efforts to go towards this, we've lost all these other things. Specific to technology, technology, again, is developmentally appropriate, or should be developmentally appropriate in Montessori. And so for the very young children, there should be, ideally, no presence of technology. As I mentioned in the presentation, our children are grounded in reality. They need us. They need that direct contact. They need the direct contact with the material. They need that opportunity to manipulate, and that's what leaves the lasting impression. Again, we were talking at lunch about, people who went to Montessori. I still have visceral memories of the puzzle maps 50 some years later. It leaves those lasting impressions. So it is important for the young children. They do not have, the adults may have technology or use of technology for record keeping or, communication or whatever. As the child's cognitive ability increases through elementary, there is some levels of appropriate technology as they get older. Certainly it is not uncommon to see access to technology in 9 to 12 classrooms, and certainly if you go beyond 9 to 12, then you will have also access to, children need access to technology to just research things today. I was so delighted to see World Books on the shelf here, and I think those are great foundational pieces again for children, and they still do need those books, and they still need those hands-on opportunity. But as their ability to abstract ideas becomes more and more sophisticated, then technology can be appropriate if carefully selected. Technology is a tool to communicate. Technology itself does not often do the teaching, is what I would say. So there is absolutely space for technology in Montessori. Our technology for the young child is the hands-on, and that is technology. I've got a couple thoughts on that one. And the first thought is, first of all, technology is changing so rapidly that what they're doing today is likely going to be very different than what they're doing tomorrow. So by the time they transition, that coding, although coding is in itself is a language, and our children learn lots in the way, languages are structures. And so all the experience that they learn in language, they can usually translate into something like coding very easily down the road. Second of all, most children are getting a large amount of exposure to technology outside of school. So this notion of our children not being ready or not being is as, like, I don't see it. And I have worked with hundreds and hundreds of children who have gone on and said, oh, well, they are so incredibly prepared that they adapt quickly, they're resilient, they're great learners, and so if they do come across something new, they pick it up very effortlessly. So it's not a concern of mine that our children, and as I said, the things are changing so rapidly, and they're changing more and more rapidly every day. Lots of our children at the school I was at for years would, go to computer camps in the summer, or they do robotics on Saturday mornings, or they do if parents really did want that. But there was equally far more children who didn't and still were completely fine when they transitioned. So I think it's a bit of I understand the concern, but I think it's kind of a moot point, actually, because I think it's not something that we need to worry about in terms of children being ready for that. What we need is children who know how to learn, and then they'll be fine. I think that they handle it because we follow the child, period. We are following what the children need, what they're ready for, what they're engaged in. I have, again, seen very few examples of children who aren't more than prepared going into whatever their next level of education. And if anything, I've heard comments like, well, I just had to unlearn what I knew for a while, or, I waited till my junior year to actually do the science that I've been doing in upper elementary. So I think we just address it naturally by following the child. And it may even be at different times for different lessons or pieces of material. You know, you have children who, you know, tend to progress very quickly in certain areas and spend a lot more time progressing through other areas. And again, that's one of the beauties of the Montessori, is it does allow that different pacing for every single child. So in my mind, and what I've read about empathy versus compassion, when you empathize with somebody, you really are putting yourself in their shoes. The difficulty sometimes is when you completely immerse yourself in somebody else's shoes or space or experience or whatever, you don't necessarily have then that distancing from a problem or from that experience to actually be the person then that can in turn provide a support and see it from an outside perspective. So it's almost like you don't want to immerse yourself so deeply in experiencing that person's pain or frustration or whatever. You want to retain a level of objectivity about that experience so you can actually understand it on a more intellectual level, and perhaps even come up with better solutions and support other people by doing that. There was, and I have no idea, I can't remember what the title was, but there was a book that came out about this in the last year, talking about this whole concept of the difference between empathy versus compassion. And I used to have great arguments with my husband about it, and he said, so you're saying like empathy is no good anymore? And I said, no, it's not quite like that way. But anyways, but the point is, there is something at a slightly higher level I think we're striving towards in Montessori, and I think we need to strive towards in society, that is something more akin to compassion. You know what? I watch them. And I really try very hard. Oh yeah. So the question is, how do I do this in home? Like, okay, we're all parents. Most of us are parents. How do we translate this to the home experience? I'm going to back up for a minute before I jump into what I started to say a minute ago. Montessori is akin to home. And so there is a piece of what we do in Montessori with the mixed age groups and with following the child and wanting, you know, true deep love is what most Montessori teachers also have for the children. So I think, first of all, we do have a model that very nicely can translate between home and school and home. Recognizing our homes are not schools, and they are environments for adults and children, and we don't have to have everything that's child size in our homes, and we don't have to, and I think that's also really good for our children. But in terms of how do I be a Montessori parent? How do I be Montessori in my own home? And I think you embrace that child, not just for who they are today, but as Montessori said, for who that child is yet to be. And so you give them space, and you give them space to fail, and you give them space to be independent, and you honor who they are as individuals, and you are very mindful, and I have to say it's very difficult as a parent, very mindful of not projecting yourself on your children, not demanding from them what you think should be happening, the pace that they should be learning at. Again, when I used to meet with parents, well, how come my child's not reading? Or how come my child's not doing this? And, there was this notion that we could, hurry up and get there. And I would often say, what about our teeth? What about the children's teeth? You could hurry them as much as you want. Those teeth are going to come in when the teeth are ready to come in. And we need to look at our whole child's development in the same manner. And we can rush things as much as we want. We can, give them the extra stuff after school and give them the tutoring or whatever. They'll do it when they're ready. Or even more frustrating, they may not do it because they weren't ready and they don't want to do what you're telling them to do. And then we've actually put them off of it. So my short answer, now that I've given a long answer, is just be mindful of who your child is and what their needs are, what their true needs are, not what they're saying sometimes their needs are. you know, they're in the grocery store lineup and they really want that candy bar at the counter. They don't really need it. That's not a need. It's what their true needs are. It's called Creating Innovators by Tony Wagner. And Tony Wagner is an interesting writer on education, and there is a lot of what he's saying that is aligning with Montessori. He tends to look at higher levels of education, sort of more the high school level. And a lot of educational thinkers are looking at high school and post-secondary school. Some of them are looking at elementary and pre-elementary. I think more people need to be looking at it. I think people need to be paying attention to that, because the bottom line is we're going to have lots of children that don't even get through high school or get to post-secondary if we're not careful. Or they certainly don't want to be lifelong learners because they've had such a bad experience in education. So we need to drop that conversation down all the way to our 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds and what are they experiencing in education. But Tony, I've read a number of his books and they're fascinating, so thank you for mentioning that. One of the things that's fascinating about Montessori is you see all these things and you think, oh my gosh, why do they need to polish leather shoes and why do they need all these things? There is that obvious skill that they're mastering through whatever that activity is. And some of those obvious skills may seem redundant today. But there's also a ton of indirect preparation going on for the child in doing those skills. So another example so you can do in Montessori material, you can actually do square root and cube root with material. And parents used to say to me, why on earth do you teach children square root and cube root? Because there's a button on that little calculator. And this was even before iPhones. And I'd say it's got nothing to do with cube root and square root. It's got to do with the mental gymnastics, the cognitive work the child is doing by washing cloths or polishing shoes or doing square root. So when we deny children these opportunities for all of these different activities, which they take great pleasure and joy in, even though they don't see them at home, we are actually denying a whole piece of their development, their cognitive development. So it's not, as I said, it's not that they're going to go home and wash all your dishes and wash your clothes on a little washboard or things like that. But the physical act of doing those things is doing a whole lot in their brain. And so that's really important. And then the second question was, what's my favorite children's house activity? See, I'm biased towards elementary. But I think my favorite one is actually washing tables. And there's so many great stories. Laura has a great story about washing tables. There's so many great stories. And I saw a child washing a table today. And one of the things that's so fascinating about washing tables, and I'm saying this as a non-CASA trained teacher, is there are 15 steps to washing tables. They have to remember 15 steps to wash the table. That prepares the child for the complex math question, the long aspects of writing. Having to hold all that in their brain is indirect preparation for all the work they're going to continue on doing. So it may look like they're just washing tables, and some children wash the table every single day. And you let that happen. And I panicked about my own son washing tables. I also panicked my own son couldn't spell, and I panicked about all these other things. And lo and behold, he's now a successful civil engineer. It does build, we don't often always see the evidence in the moment, but if we trust in our child and trust they're doing what they need to do and that they are continually building those cognitive, they're building themselves cognitively and making all those connections of synapses and things like that, we are helping them and helping to prepare them for the future.